My name is Adina Heard, and if you heard what I heard, you would never forget.
If you heard what I heard. This podcast shares the powerful stories of Holocaust survivors, told by their grandchildren, the last generation to ever hear Holocaust survivor stories firsthand. So join me as we listen, learn, and remember. Together, we can make sure the world will never forget so that it never happens again.
I am the granddaughter of two Holocaust survivors. Today, I'll be sharing the story of my grandfather, Sam Moss. My grandfather, Sam, was born Sweetheart Fadenblum in 1925 in Munkacs, Czechoslovakia. He was from quite a devout Jewish family. They were Hasidim of the Munkacs Rebbe. And from the very young age of 5, he remembers going to Cheder, walking in the snow very early. My grandfather's friends described him as studious and a really a great scholar. He came from quite a big family. He had uncles and aunties, a lot of cousins. His father was in business with a lot of his brothers. They would eat Friday night together at their grandmother's house every Friday night. She would never allow any differences or arguments in the family, and they were constantly being brought together on Adine and holidays. It was a really beautiful, close-knit family life before the war. Even though my grandfather did have a really beautiful family life before the war and always did well in school, he did struggle. He lost his mother at the age of 2. And his father remarried. So he had a stepmother and a stepsister. And I do feel this was still a difficult time in his life. In 1942, when the Nazis came into Munkacs and rounded the Jews out to take them to the ghetto, my grandfather was 17 years old. So my grandfather doesn't remember any warning signs at the time. It's interesting because this was in 1942, so things were happening in Europe, across Europe, to all the Jewish communities. But I think it's indicative of how insular their community was, and they really just weren't aware of what was going on. It happened very quickly. The way he describes it, it was almost overnight. It was black and white. You didn't have time to think. He describes the ghetto as very tough. It was very difficult, obviously, for everybody. It was very cramped. Where there was one family, they put 6 families. People were sick. There wasn't enough food. And things happened so quickly in Munkacs that they were only in the ghetto for 1 month before they were moved to Auschwitz. And my grandfather was young. He asked a lot of questions. He couldn't understand it. And he always spoke about being very confused. So the Nazis rounded them up and forced them onto the cattle cars. He shared a story that when he was on the platform before he was being hurled into the car, he saw some friends jumping over a gate and running. And he turned to his father and he said, "Can I run?" And my great-grandfather said, "No, you need to stay with the family." And so he listened and he got onto the train. My grandfather describes the cattle cars as being so cramped. They were meant for cattle. People were urinating on the floor. There was no place to breathe. He would stand on his tippy toes to try to reach a window to get a fresh breath of air. And it was obviously a very traumatic experience for him. They arrive at Auschwitz after a really long ride on these cattle car trains. They're hungry, they're starving, they haven't showered in days. And the doors open, and my grandfather describes it that it was hell. He said the word, "You just knew you were in hell." He saw naked men and women, shaved and running around. He saw smoke coming out of the chimneys. He describes the orchestra. He remembered the orchestra, the famous orchestra on the platform in Auschwitz, playing music, and he remembers that vividly. And he just talks about this utter confusion. It was like there was a psychological trauma. They were trying to confuse people. There was chaos. There was smoke. People were running. He describes babies being thrown from their mother's arms. He talks about old women being pushed to the floor. He turned to an inmate that he was in pajamas who had been there already for a few months and asked him, what is the smoke? He said, "What?" He points to the big chimneys and all the smoke. He said, "What is that?" And the inmate said, "We're all going to hell. We're dying and we're all going to hell." And he knew in that moment that he was probably going to his death. So they arrive in Auschwitz, the whole family. They had been transported together. his uncles, aunts, cousins, his stepmother and stepsister. And immediately, majority of his family, everybody were sent to the left and sent to their deaths, and they were murdered in the gas chambers. And my grandfather, his father, and his uncle Emil were sent to the right to work. They were in Auschwitz for a very short period of time. And then they were moved from there to Birkenau and then to Plaszow. In Plaszow, he was put to work. He was digging tunnels underground, and he talks about like having to pull all the concrete and like with his bare hands. It was very difficult work. And he was constantly in a lot of pain from it. It's interestingly in Plaszow, he tells a story that on his way to work, they had to march from where the camp was to where they would work. He was befriended by an SS guard, and the guard took an interest in him. My grandfather was quite a smart, studious, cultured person, and they would talk about, and he actually spoke German as well, and they would talk about philosophy and science and culture, and a friendship began. A couple of months into Plaszow, my great-grandfather, Sam's father, was during selection, was sent to the left, and was basically put in the line for the gas chambers. He was old at the time and getting sick. And so my grandfather followed him to the line to death. The SS man came up to him and said, "Don't go with your father. He's going to be killed. Come back. Let me news you." And my grandfather said, "No, I'm not going without my father," and I stayed in the line. 20 minutes later, the SS man came, took both my grandfather and my great-grandfather out of the line and put them back in the line for life. It's interesting that in a place like so void of like all humanity and like any kind of kindness, my grandfather experienced this from like a Nazi. It does show that even in like the darkest places, there's still humanity. And I think this story like touched my grandfather for many years. So as the Russians came closer, they were taken from Plaszow to Dachau on a death march. And my grandfather says it was one of the most difficult experiences. They were on foot. It was summer. It was very hot. His father was sick at the time, so I believe he carried his father on his back. And my grandfather said that at the time, they were feeding them salty herring. The Nazis would give them salty herring to eat. They were incredibly thirsty. And they would march during the day, and at night they would rest. And one night they came to a lake, and people were so thirsty that they ran to the lake, and the Nazis gunned them down. And he said the lake was filled with bodies and blood. All you saw was just red. And he said it was then that he learned that thirst is so much greater than hunger. 4,000 people left Plaszow and 490 people arrived in Dachau. Just those numbers to me are overwhelming. We think we talk about the millions and the millions, and it's hard to describe, but 4,000 people just marching. People had gone down in the rivers and the lakes. People are dying of starvation and thirst, and 490 people make it to Dachau. My grandfather has a lot of miraculous stories that happened like during the Holocaust, miraculous stories of survival. But there's really one story that stands out to my family that happened when he got to Dachau. So my grandfather arrives in Dachau. He becomes ill. I believe it was in typhus. He was in his bunker. He explains that he was like all bones, the skin and bones. He obviously hadn't eaten for many months. So my great-grandfather, trying to find anything to help my grandfather survive, went to the kitchens to ask for extra food. And he found a young boy, a 14-year-old boy named Oscar, and said, "Please, help me feed my son. He's dying of typhus." And the boy obviously said no, it was a big risk. It could have costed his life. So my great-grandfather said to him, "Come, let me show you." He followed my great-grandfather to the barracks, and he saw my grandfather lying there, skin and bone, very sick with fever. And he told my great-grandfather, okay, I'm going to help you. So every day he would go to the bottom of the pot and get extra potatoes and extra soup, and he would feed it, give it to my great-grandfather to feed my grandfather. And slowly but surely, my grandfather regained his strength. He got better. And then they were liberated. My grandfather does explain that they heard the bombs coming closer and closer, and they knew that the Allies were there. They were marched from Dachau to Feldafing, which was a little camp near Landsberg and Lech. And then he was liberated at the end of April in 1945. Interestingly, he didn't speak so much about his liberation. And I know it was also because he was still quite sick. He had recovered from the typhus, but he was so sick that he was actually taken immediately to hospital from the concentration camp, and he stayed in hospital for 6 months. During that time, his father got remarried to another Polish woman who he said was very nice. So he left the hospital. He had recovered, and he decided to go back to Munkacs to look for his uncle, so he was very close with. Upon returning to Munkacs, he realized that all of his family had been killed and murdered, and he had a bad experience with a Russian over there. I think a lot of people experience this when they would go back to their hometowns. They were being treated badly. So he decided he had enough. He left Munkacs and he made his way to Prague. It was there that he befriended two boys, young boys who had just come out of the camps, who were also hustling around trying to make money. One of the boys' names was Sam Moskowitz. They knew they had to leave Europe, and Sam Moskowitz somehow got his hands on 3 different passports. At that time, you had to go through like a health screening to get your papers in order to leave. Remember, these boys had come from the camps. They had no documents. They had obviously, no like forms of ID. So everything had to start from scratch, and I had to go through all the bureaucracy around it. And my grandfather couldn't pass any of the health tests because he still had a lot of health issues around the tuberculosis and typhus that he had contracted while he was in the camps. So he wasn't able to get any passports, and his 2 best friends at the time were ready to leave. They wanted to go to America. So Sam Moskowitz said, listen, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to give you my Australian passport. You're going to take the photo out, put your own photo in, and you're going to go as Sam Moskowitz to Australia. It was the only way for them to leave. Before you know it, Prague is in the distance. He's on the boat and he's headed to Australia to start a new life. Sam Moskowitz arrives in Australia, and immediately he goes about setting up his new life. He's a very strong-willed, resilient person. So although he landed with nothing in his pockets, no family, he immediately got to work. He opened up a delicatessen. It was a really fresh start for him, and I feel like he just put all of his effort and mind on moving forward with his life. Eventually, he met my grandmother, Relia, a beautiful pianist from Australia. And they got married, and they had 2 sons, my father, Mayor Moss, and his younger brother, Stephen. And they had a really beautiful life together. Although he was raised in a devout Jewish family as a chassid of the Munkacs Rebbe, when he did come to Australia, he let go of most or all of his Judaism. They were not Shomer Shabbat in any way. They were not religious. It wasn't until later in life, when my father was 18 years old, that he went to yeshiva and came across, I guess, religion and faith in his own way, and he became religious. And it was because my father became religious that my grandfather was brought closer to Judaism. And so it was later in life that my grandfather, I guess, reestablished his faith and love for Judaism. So my grandfather built a really beautiful life for himself. He became quite successful after the convenience stores. He moved into schmatzes. He built probably one of Australia's biggest schmatzer business at the time. When my father was 13 years old, his mother got sick with cancer and she passed away. And it's painful to think about because after everything my grandfather had been through in the Holocaust, losing all of his family, he comes to Australia, builds a beautiful life, and then he's hit with another storm. And like always, he pushed through it. He raised the two boys, and he just committed himself to work and family. He was the kind of guy that he's in it. He's 100%. And I think that same resilience and, need to survive is that same spirit that he took with him in his whole life, because I think that's what helped create his success. I think that's what pushed him. He became involved in community. He was really well respected, took on a lot of leadership roles, and he had a deep, deep love for Israel. He knew that Israel, what a gift it was, and he supported many Israeli institutions, gave a lot of money to Jewish education around the world. And later on in life, when my father was in his 20s, my grandfather remarried a beautiful, elegant lady called Adine, who was from Hungary. And she brought in 3 children to the marriage, and our family grew. And the two of them dedicated their lives to community and to family. My grandfather and Oscar, the boy who saved his life, lost touch over the years, and connected again in his 80s. And the reunion was obviously a very emotional one. There was a lot of tears and hugging. And Oscar became a real figure in our family. He came to all of our weddings and simchas. They stayed friends for many years until my grandfather passed away. Oscar passed away, I think it was about 5 years after my grandfather did. About 2 months after Oscar passed away, my sister gave birth to twin boys, and she named one of them Svi Yoshua, and Oscar. It's crazy to think that this one act of kindness stayed in our family for so long. That's how much it meant to us. We truly feel that you save one life, you save an entire world. Oscar holds a really special place in our heart. The earliest memory I have of even understanding or knowing what the Holocaust was, I think I was about 6 or 8. Every year for the Seder, families would gather together and we would all gather around and sit at the table. When we got up to the part in the Haggadah, Avadam, I remember my grandfather would get quite emotional and he would cry. I remember some years he was so overcome with emotion, he would have to stand up and leave. And there was one time, I must have been 6 years old, where I noticed my grandfather crying. And I turned to my father and I said, "Why is Saba crying?" And my father said, "Because Saba was once a slave too." And I think it was then that I first had any kind of idea that my grandfather had experienced something so terrible. Of course, at that age, I didn't really comprehend what it was. But that's the earliest memory for me about hearing about the Holocaust and what he had gone through and experienced. You have to understand, we didn't hear their stories in one piece. They were bits and pieces, small conversations here and there that we experienced over our lifetime. And it was never one thing, one complete story at once. And it wasn't until much later on, we were in high school, where my sisters and I had projects. We had to write the stories down. And it was only then that we ever really heard it in an official capacity. But most of the time, they were very guarded about it. They didn't want to share. It was very emotional. And my grandfather was a very forward-looking, thinking person. I definitely felt emotional and understood the magnitude of the story, even when I was in high school. But interestingly, I think his story definitely took on an even deeper and new meaning like post October 7th. I think for me, having a grandfather that's a Holocaust survivor kind of pushed me to step into my role as a Jewish person in a way that I don't know that I would have if not. After October 7th happened, my mother, she went out and she bought Magen David necklaces for all the daughters and granddaughters in our family. So thank God, that's like 30 or 40 necklaces. And I remember standing there packing it up, and all I could think about was this symbol that once mocked him for death is now something that we get to wear with like pride and gratitude. And all his great grandchildren and daughters get to wear it. And it felt like a full circle moment for me, and I'm sure for my family too, that how firstly grateful and lucky we are, but also what it means to be the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. It is up to us to stand up and wear our Judaism with pride. And in a way, we get to heal that little part of the generational trauma that was shut down. They were silenced. The Magen David was mocked and for death. It feels filling. What is the biggest lesson I learned from my grandfather? You know, it's interesting. Like I sit here and there are so many things that we can take away from his story of survival and his success later in life. And I think the one thing that kind of weaves its way through his entire lifespan and his survival and everything that he went through is a quote by Viktor Frankl. And it says, everything can be taken from you but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, which our ability to choose our response and attitude to any given circumstance. And if I think about anything that really encapsulates who my grandfather was, it's that he really embodied the idea that anything you set your mind to and want to accomplish, you'll get there. And he used to say, like, Malin, I can take everything from you but what's in here. And what he meant is that it's really your choice in life that will define who you are. And if I look at it, I know that that's really like the thing that underpins his survival story during the Holocaust. He made this decision to live. He made the choice to fight and keep going. And that's what contributed to his survival. And then later in life, it also contributed to his success and the role he played in the community and his leadership roles. And if I think about it, it's really something that has stayed with me in my life and has become the blueprint for how I live my life and how I overcome my own personal struggles. And I think that's really what it means to be the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, that just their memory of who they were and what they experienced impacts on life and gives us so much strength on a day-to-day basis. I find myself going through the day or hitting a struggle, and I ask myself, like, constantly, what would Saba do? My cousins and I and my siblings, we are the last generation to hear his story. And I really feel that it's our responsibility to not just hold his legacy, but really celebrate who he was also after the Holocaust and everything that he rebuilt, and to pass it on to our children and show them that we should be proud Jews and that anything is possible. I also always tell my kids, like, you're descendants of warriors. The people that came before you went through so much struggle and saw the worst of mankind, and they came out and they still always tried to look for the light, and they still believed in people, and they still believed in humanity. And think that they were able to do that, to me, that's what it means to be Jewish, is that it doesn't matter what struggle you go through or what we're up against, we somehow always have the capacity to find the positive, to find the light, and to always lean into life. If I could say anything to my family that was lost in the Holocaust, I would tell them that we're still here. We're still living our Jewish life with our Jewish babies, and we're stepping into what it means to be Jewish, and we're standing up, and we're not letting the world silence us anymore. That's really what I would tell them. Never forget is our segue into never again. If you don't learn history, you're being to repeat it. And in every aspect, I mean, it's why we have our history, right? So why would somebody not Jewish want to learn about this? Is because you have to understand where the source of hate comes from. Hate and concentration camps don't happen overnight. They happen by a slow trickle of hate that seeps itself into society and creates a movement, but it's small little things. And if you don't understand how that happens, then you are not able to put a stop where you're meant to, where a stop needs to be made. At the end of the day, number one thing for my grandfather was family. When he passed, he was sick in bed for many days before, and the entire family stood around his bedside. There must have been 30 of us. And we were all there as he took his last breath. He went out like a king. And all I could think about was that in the years of so much loneliness and so much pain and being abandoned by the world, he left this world being surrounded by so much love. And admiration, his family loved him so much. And he was truly like a shepherd. He guided us in all the best ways. And I feel so grateful that I had somebody like him as my life guide and my grandfather, because he has taught me things that you can't learn in a lifetime. There are so many things that I am proud of my grandfather for. Beyond just being his grandchild, proud of his ability to overcome so much struggle and hardship. I'm proud of the life he built when he had nothing left. And I'm proud of who he became. It feels like he built himself up from ashes. He passed away 7 years ago. And 9 months after he passed, I named my oldest son Sam. And as I was standing there, like naming my firstborn child, I couldn't be more proud of who he was as a person, and that I could get to name my child after him. He was everything I believe in, like a person should grow and become. He was resilient and strong-willed and determined and kind, amazing to his family and to community. And he dedicated like his life to growth. And I'm so proud to be his granddaughter.
Thank you for listening to If You Heard What I Heard. If you'd like to learn more about our work and support our mission to make sure the world never forgets, please visit our website, ifyouheardwhatiheard.com. We will never let these stories be lost. It is the job of our generation to make sure future generations never forget, so that it never happens again.